Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Mary Milroy and I am a member of the Missouri Valley Master Gardeners. And I have to do a little disclaimers. When I took the course, it wasn't because I knew anything at all about gardening. But my grandfather was a fabulous gardener and I always wished I would have paid more attention because later on I really wanted to garden. And then my husband and I made a few fledgling attempts, and with busy careers and 4 very busy kids, our gardens were really not very good. So when I retired, the first thing I did was take the Master Gardener course because I didn't know anything, but it's a fabulous course. So they even let people who know nothing take the course. So I would say the next time it comes around, it's a fabulous course. So well worth it. And the topic for today is going to be on compost. And again, I am not the world's expert on compost, but I'm here to tell you kind of my husband's and my experience with it, and to reassure you that it is very forgiving and you just almost can't go wrong. So it's the perfect kind of thing to do. And so what the topic is Compost 101, and it's really just turning garbage into gardener's gold. And so overall, we're going to talk about a couple different things. First of all, just really what is compost? Why would a person want to compost? And really how to kind of get started in composting. And the question of what is compost is actually just taking a control. Aerobic is important, so it requires air. And so our little organisms really require oxygen. And it converts organic material like your household garbage kind of stuff, like banana peels and potato peels and carrot tops or whatever, into really amazingly rich organic material that you can use in your garden. And compost itself, I guess for a while I was calling it soil, but compost makes up the organic component of soil. So it's really a soil amendment is how you use it. And really the end product is going to be kind of a dark, crumbly, very earthy smelling substance that's dark and beautiful and doesn't smell like garbage at all. So that's good. And I brought a couple samples I'll pass around in a minute. But anyway, what happens is you put all these in the size of about a pea. There's like about 1 billion microorganisms. And so what you do is in compost, you put all those little organisms to work for you to make this happen. And so you have sort of like an entire food web all growing in your compost pile. And so what happens is these little microorganisms and some macroorganisms live on all the stuff that we put into there. And they use the carbon and the nitrogen from the things we put in there. And they also require some water and they require some oxygen. And so it's really simple, really 4 things, and that's all it is. When you look at the science of how this works, plants grow by capturing energy actually from the sun and carbon dioxide from the air, and then they sort of take the nutrients in the water, and then they sort of do their magic and photosynthesis, and they just really create life as we know it. We couldn't live without our plants. But when our plants die, they become really raw material for the composting process. And then the microorganisms, fungi, insects, worms, mites, so both microorganisms and macroorganisms actually go ahead and take the carbon out of that and turn it into energy for their own bodies and then back into the soil. So they work hard at decomposing. And then the plants and microorganisms use that carbon, and then the cycle keeps going and going and going. The kind of cool thing is nature's been composting for millions of years. There's no waste in nature. Everything just goes around and around in the cycle. So what we're doing is kind of making a little mini cycle in our compost bin or compost pile or whatever we want. And actually, compost has been around for a long time. We think maybe it's something new, but if you actually look up some of the history of it, the first recorded human use of compost was actually in Egypt, and that was about 3000 BC. A lot of farmers found out that if they just put like animal manure, like from horses and cows, on their fields, a very raw kind of compost, that actually it was good nutrition. Their crops actually grew better. Kind of almost by accident, they found that if they had sort of piles of manure and they mixed up some of the straw when they were cleaning out some of the stalls, and a little bit of rain fell on it, pretty soon they sort of had a compost pile. And they found that that started to decompose and make really very rich kind of soil amendments that they could use. So it's really been around a long time. The Greeks and Romans used it, and there's even writing that if they were doing kind of more of the warm, hot composting, that they would actually be able to grow vegetables in the winter in some of their compost piles. And then some of the Christian monasteries kept composting alive in Europe after the fall of Rome. And actually, Shakespeare mentions compost a couple times in several of his plays. So it's kind of been around. And even George Washington and Thomas Jefferson wrote quite a bit about using compost to help kind of enrich some of the soils on the East Coast that were becoming depleted. In the 1900s, as I looked up some research on this, about 90% of the fertilizer in the United States really was compost. There were smaller farms. A lot of farms did a lot of their own composting and used that. However, in 1913, there was a German company that came up with a way to kind of use synthetic nitrogen compounds, and one of that was fertilizer. And I guess fertilizer you can do in massive quantities, and I suppose as farms got bigger and weren't so much the small family farms, that and it was probably a little easier, came in a bag or whatever. And actually by 1950, only about 1% of the fertilizer in the U.S. Actually came from compost. And the way I heard it kind of described as the difference is your fertilizer sort of feeds the plant, your compost feeds the soil. So you're kind of feeding something different. And by using the compost, you actually continue to grow and enrich your soil, which actually does enrich your plants, but you really are more feeding the soil rather than directly the plant. In the 1940s, it did seem that there was a resurgence in the use of compost and kind of the birth of organic farming as a kind of as a new sort of new concept to encourage people to try and use more of the organic methods. And there's Rodale was a noted pioneer in that. And to this day, there still is a Rodale Institute that if you want to read about organic farming or have a lot of questions about that, they've got a really amazing website with more information than I'll probably ever remember, but it's really good. In the 1960s, the environmental movement then went ahead and promoted composting. And in the 70s and 80s, it became more and more popular, and many communities actually started kind of community compost piles. And I know a lot of times even out in Yankton, at the landfill, you can go ahead and get compost. So it became more widely known and more used. And I guess why compost? I guess why would we want to put these big piles out in back of our yards and things? But really, compost is a very resourceful way to go ahead and recycle a lot of the scraps from our kitchens and from our yard that normally we might just throw away. And actually, when you look at the amount of material that goes into landfills, it's estimated that probably about 30% at least comes out of household waste. So if we could eliminate some of that, there's a whole bunch of things. Our amount of garbage that we generate is much less. Probably the garbage trucks have to make less trips, so we probably save gas and emissions there. And the landfills don't fill up so fast. And not only we get like a super bonus of this really wonderful free soil amendment that we can go ahead and use. So it's kind of a win-win all around. And the other thing about it too is it decreases greenhouse gases. And part of that is because when we compost, we're using an aerobic process to go ahead and decompose this. In a lot of the landfills and different places where we dump all this stuff and then we pile it up, there really isn't any air in that. It all gets compressed and nobody goes out there and turns it and all that kind of stuff. And so what happens is it becomes a very anaerobic process, and then it releases methane into the air. And we know that methane is kind of one of our greenhouse gases that we don't want in our atmosphere. So there's a whole lot of ways that this really helps us. And I guess the thing about it too is really when you compost, it has, you can use as much or as little effort as you like. And it really, you don't need a whole lot of fancy equipment. It really doesn't cost you much. You don't need any experience, and I'm speaking from personal experience. And it actually can really be kind of fun, actually. And it saves money because instead of having to go buy a bunch of expensive fertilizer, you can use this beautiful compost, and it really works great. And you sort of have this pride that you sort of made it. And so that's actually pretty cool. Really, the components is pretty straightforward. All of our little micro and macroorganisms, they only really need food, of course, just like any living thing, they need food. And usually that comes from carbon and nitrogen. And the ideal ratio is about 30 carbon to about 1 nitrogen. And we'll talk about that more because actually we don't actually measure that. You sort of approximate and guess and kind of learn as you go. So again, that's sort of just, you try, oh, this doesn't work, I think I'll try that, and it sort of works out eventually. And air, we want to keep our process aerobic, so we want to make sure that we don't press it down too hard, and we do turn it, because we want the little organisms to go ahead and have oxygen so they continue an aerobic process rather than an anaerobic process. The other thing too is aerobic processes really don't smell. As soon as it turns anaerobic, then it kind of starts to smell sort of putrid and gross. So if you've got a compost that's working well, it actually should not smell. It shouldn't just smell like a big garbage pile. And water. The organisms really, they're living, they need to have water. Some of the water will come out of some of the food waste that you put in, but a lot of times, especially like in South Dakota, especially like this summer where it got so hot, you do need to add some extra water to make sure it doesn't get too dried out. And temperature, the aerobic bacteria really like it above 50 degrees, but and below 50 degrees, it's not that it doesn't work, it just really slows down. So in types of composting, as I started doing some research for this talk, I actually was really surprised at how many there were, because I was really just sort of familiar with backyard composting, but there's really quite a few topics, and I didn't even get into all of them. They had this many different kinds that you could do, and so these are sort of some of the basic kinds. But the one type is fast or hot composting, and that one is probably one that I've heard graduate level composting. You probably need to be real careful about stuff. Slow cold composting, that's really what I've been doing and what I'll kind of give our experience later with that one. And that's sort of the easy one. And so that's a great way to start. And compost tea is one that I'll mention just because in Master Gardener meetings and things, I heard people talk about this compost tea, and I always kind of thought, I wonder what that is. And so as I started going to this, I thought, I better research that and figure out what it is. So actually, I read about it. I've never done it, but I now have a better idea of actually what it is. The fast, hot composting is one that really is called graduate level composting because you need to be really, really careful about all the components to make sure everything comes out right. And you need to be very careful about your ratios, and you need to really be careful about your oxygenation. A lot of the bacteria like it about 21%, just like the air that we're breathing today, and they like the water. So all the components, they really want it kind of like a chemistry experiment. They want it all really pretty exact and careful. In fast compost, it'll get very, very hot. It'll heat up. Your pile will get to about 120 to 150 degrees, and it actually will steam. The nice thing about that, though, is sometimes people can get compost within probably just a month. It'll be real fast. Whereas sometimes the cold one, you probably will harvest maybe once or twice a year. So that one is a lot of work, but you get a lot of compost real fast. And the high temperature, the other benefit about that one is it gets hot enough to kill most of the weed seeds and some of the pathogens that are in there. So with the cold, you need to be a little more careful about maybe not putting weeds in, because it probably won't get hot enough to kill all the weed seeds, and you don't want to go ahead and start mixing those all in your garden. We probably have plenty of weeds anyway without planting some new ones. And the fast composting takes extra effort, but it really gets a high quality product really fast. I have to say, we've never actually done that. And so if you kind of fall off and it's not happening, it turns into a cold compost. So you're not like totally lost. It still works. It's okay. It just changes. But in that, you have to think about these little organisms are really small. We have these little microorganisms, and even the macroorganisms, the biggest one's probably an earthworm. So nobody's really big. And so the food that they use, it's really helpful if it's small, because they don't want to eat big chunks of stuff because they're very little. And so small particles have a lot more surface area for them to go ahead and digest. And so if you're going to do a hot compost, you probably need to take some extra time and grind and smash and chop to get pretty uniform little tiny particles. And the hot composting, they like it about 1/8 to 1/2 inch, so really pretty small. Very small. And the fast hot one, people can make piles, and it actually you'll actually see it steam. They're very, very, very hot, but they go very fast, which is pretty cool. And the question that got asked, and I saw it in a lot of books in different places, is actually, do they actually catch fire? And apparently that's really pretty rare in a home compost. In some of the big industrial ones where they're very, very huge, sometimes that has happened, but it's supposed to be very, very rare in a home one where they're smaller. And certainly if you keep them a little moist, like we should, it's very, very rare that they would catch fire. So, and if you don't do the ideal conditions, if you start with good intentions, you're going to do it hot, and then it doesn't, that's okay. It just turns into cold composting. It's really okay. So the game's not lost. And the microorganisms still work. They're all still there. They're going on. But it's just a little bit slower. So you won't get it quite as fast, but you'll still get a beautiful product. And you can do it. The thing about that is that you can do it all kinds of ways. There's no right and wrong way. A lot of people just make a pile. That's pretty easy. You just make a pile. You don't need any special equipment whatsoever. And otherwise, you can go ahead and build some of your own. You can take pallets, you can take old fencing, and just build a spot to contain it. You can get real fancy and go on the internet. They have all kinds of tumblers and cool things that you can get to put it in. And I think sometimes in town, a contained one like a tumbler might be really nice, and maybe your neighbors will be happier if you do that. But there's lots of ways you can do it. There's just really no right and wrong. And the good thing is they all work. So that's like super cool. The compost tea, this is where I did some of my research to figure out what this actually is. And compost tea actually uses a system where the organic materials are saturated with water. In the other one, in the fast or the slow, you want it moist, but you definitely don't want it where you can just wring out water. In the compost tea, you actually really want it wet. It is a wet kind of composting. And there's two kind of main ways. You can do an aerated or a non-aerated. And the aerated one is the water actually gets added to organic material, and then you have some kind of a pump that aerates it. It keeps the air going. You can buy commercial ones. You can actually do one at home and just hook it up to like maybe an aquarium pump or something, but it needs to be super aerated. It isn't just turning your pile, it's aerating it. And so that one people can do. The non-aerated one is one that if you look in a lot of the organic farming kind of websites and different things, they'll have a lot of details on how you do it. And this one, you have to use mature compost. You can't put like all your kitchen scraps and all that kind of stuff. So you need to have your mature compost first, and then you just put it into a bucket and you kind of stir it up for about 7 to 10 days, and then you kind of strain off that liquid that happens. And so that you strain it, and then you use that liquid at the end. The kind of nice thing about that is you can use it anytime. You can put it in the soil. You can actually even spray it on the leaves as long as you don't do it when it's real sunny. And so it has a lot of uses, and a lot of organic gardeners really love it. And the final product that you get from either one's called compost tea. And however, as I read, the more I read, there's definitely some controversy about this. If you go to a lot of the university sites, there's really some lack of scientific evidence on whether this really works a whole lot better than just regular old composting, and what the benefits are. So probably more research needs to be done, because if you really look at a lot of the university sites, they actually make the statements that there's not an awful lot of scientific published evidence on this. On the other hand, if you go to a lot of the gardening sites and the organic sites, people just swear by it. So I guess I would say maybe try it yourselves. We have not ever done that, but it certainly has a lot of very enthusiastic followers that swear by it in their gardens. And this is just an example of one of the kinds of the aerated ones, and the commercial ones you can get from probably 10 gallons to 500 gallons. It did look like a lot of them were really expensive, though. I thought they're way up in many hundreds to many thousands of dollars. So it looked like you'd really need to want to do it. And the other way is you can make some at home if you want to actually rig up your aquarium pump and all that kind of stuff. The ones that are non-aerated, this is the one you use just the mature compost, you don't put raw stuff in there. And really, then you probably only need like a bucket and a sieve, and you're probably good to go. So you just put your compost, add some water, keep stirring it 1 or 2 times a day for about 7 to 10 days, and strain it. And then you have this kind of black liquid gold, I guess, and you can use it in your garden. One of the other kinds, this is another one that I read about. We had a talk a couple years ago at one of the seed libraries from somebody who does a lot of the vermicompost, which is worm composting. And one of the benefits, I have to say, I haven't done it either, but now I'm kind of interested, and I'm sort of thinking we might have to put a little worm bin under our kitchen sink. But anyway, I haven't talked Ann into it yet. But anyway, but what that does is it's a product of worm digestion. And it also uses kind of an aerobic decomposition and uses micro and macroorganisms. So you let the little organisms continue to work with you. And these little guys don't like light. And so a lot of people think that basements, under sinks and stuff work really well. And this is actually an option for people that maybe live in an apartment or somewhere, or have a small yard or close neighbors, where a compost pile is really not really feasible. And so even in an apartment, you could have your little guys working for you under your kitchen sink. And the vermicomposting produces a rich organic soil amendment called worm castings, often sometimes just called worm poop. And anyway, it has a diversity of plant nutrients. It's very, very good for your plants. And you can add it anytime during the growing season. There's one caution about it. You can't go out and just catch your own worms, because the earthworms and stuff don't work. You have to have a correct kind of worm to make this thing happen. The one that's used probably the most often is this Icenia fetida. They're just called red wigglers. And another one I saw was Icenia andrae was used. But it seems like the red wigglers are the ones that people really, really find effective. And absolutely don't use some of the garden worms and stuff that you can find. They won't work. So, and you can do homemade bins, you can do commercial bins. There's a lot of cool ways to do this. And so when you do this, you select a bin, and I have some pictures of different kinds. It's really just a spot to keep your worms there. You add some bedding, which usually is just newspaper. You add, and a lot of people will add just maybe like a little bit of compost, add a little bit of soil, just to make sure you have a good like inoculation of microorganisms in your newspaper. And then you order your worms, you kind of let your environment sort of settle for a bit. And then you introduce the worms to the bin. Usually you put them on top. Sometimes if you keep a little light going, they don't like light at all. So then that encourages them to burrow down into your bin so they don't try and escape. And then you start feeding kind of slowly. Remember, they're just sort of little guys. And so a lot of people think that probably maybe weekly, put a small layer of fresh fruits and vegetable waste. In this one, you probably want to use more like the fruit and vegetable waste, not all the other stuff like maybe eggshells and some of the stuff that we maybe would put into a big compost pile. And then make sure you cover it with some more newspaper bedding kind of stuff. And then that'll cut down getting things like fruit flies. You don't want all your food sitting on the top because you're going to start getting fruit flies and things. So if you keep it covered, then the little worms will just come and start working on it, and kind of keep an eye on it to make sure they're eating enough so you don't feed them too much. Remember, they're just little guys, so more of a thin layer and then cover it. And, most of them can be maybe once a week, every other week. And so you probably, if you have big volumes of like kitchen waste, the worms might not keep up with it. You might be better with a big compost pile. But if you're in an apartment and you're, maybe a single or a couple or small family, that might be just fine, because a lot of times they actually said that each worm will probably eat about half its body weight every day. So, which is pretty impressive, actually. And so actually they do a pretty dang good job of going through a lot of the kitchen waste. And you do need to keep an eye on the temperature. They like kind of 50 to 70 degrees. They don't want to be freezing cold. They don't want to be really hot. And and the moisture, when you put the newspaper in, it's going to actually be, you get it soaked and then you wring it out so it's pretty moist. But if it dries out, you're going to need to maybe use a spray bottle and keep it a little moist because they like to have their skin a little bit moist. They don't like to really dry out. And some of the acidity you want to keep an eye on. I saw that with some of the kitchen waste, they suggested maybe not using a lot of acidic foods like maybe citrus peels and things like that, because it is pretty harmful if that gets too acidic for your worms. So more things like, carrot peelings and potato peelings or whatever you want to use is probably better. And if you're interested in doing this, bins can be made at home. You can buy them online. You just need to make sure they have lots of holes, because these little guys want to have an aerobic process. So you need to make sure that they have plenty of air. And sometimes people even make sure they're a little bit off the floor so that there's pretty good air circulation around them. And again, you go on the internet, you can find, there are just so many kinds that are probably just simple bags, all the way up to, I think that was called the Compost Factory, where you fill the first one, and then when that's all full, you start putting some food and newspaper in the next one. The worms all move up, and then when that's all full, you start the next layer, and the worms keep moving all up till you have the whole thing full. So that's actually called the Worm Factory. So, and these are our little red wigglers. Those are our friends. And some people just take just a simple, plastic bin, make some holes, and it should have a fairly tight fitting lid, but you need to have lots of holes. And when you're actually doing this, you want to fill probably 1/2 to 3/4 of the bin with newspaper. And actually, as you can see, you really soak it first and then kind of wring it out. So this isn't just dry newspaper. You're putting the newspaper. You add about a handful of garden soil or compost just to maybe get some, make sure you have plenty of microorganisms and stuff in there. And then you just wait and add your worms. And sure enough, they all start composting. And you want to feed kind of leftover fruit and vegetables. You want the food under the newspaper so you don't get a bunch of fruit flies in your kitchen. And you don't want to overfeed. And again, you don't want to feed anything like meat, dairy, fat, oils, stuff like that, because then it really will start getting stinky. So you don't want to do that. And you might need to replace the newspaper sometimes, so you can, as you feed, you want to maybe keep adding a little bit of extra, and then you keep it moist. And then ultimately you can go ahead and harvest. And as you can see, the worm castings, they look great. I mean, and you hold them and they're rich and they're black, and they just work wonders. And to get into backyard composting is probably what most of us, this is what we've been doing, and why probably most of you are here. And I guess when you're going to start composting, I think probably one of the very first things you need to really think about is where you're going to do this. And again, kind of like real estate, sort of location, location, location. And it's important to be sort of convenient. If you put it off in a distant place, you probably aren't going to use it very often. It's going to be really awkward and inconvenient. And so kind of think about how you are going to get your household waste out to it and how close it is to the garden. How much of a headache is it going to be to get this stuff to the garden? You want it in a location that's not too hot and not too cold, because you do want it to be pretty warm, but right in the sun, sometimes if it gets really, really hot, it actually dries it out so fast it's hard to keep up with the moisture. So an area that's maybe kind of part sun is probably ideal. It's nice to avoid windy spots if you can. That was impossible for us. Ours is windy. We just live on a hill. It's just windy. We live in South Dakota. It's windy. So you do the best you can. Distance to the house. We're a little distance out to our bin, but I'll show you what we did to kind of solve that. Because sometimes in the winter, you don't want to run all the way out to the bin. And so you kind of want to avoid having your compost too close to trees and raspberries. I read a lot online about how people had thought, oh, I'll just put it under this tree. This is pretty handy. It'll give it a little bit of shade. This is great. And then they were a little dismayed that all the tree roots came right up through the bin. That's beautiful, rich, wonderful soil stuff. And the tree said, thank you. And there was all filled with roots. That was not good. And the raspberries do the same thing. If you have raspberries, they'll meander over, and the next thing you know, they will take over your compost. So maybe don't go too close to those guys. And you want a fairly level site, a little easier to manage like that. You would like it to be well drained. You don't want this thing to sit like a big saturated bathtub. That's not going to work. And if you live in town, you maybe don't want it right next to your neighbor's fence. So maybe keep it a little bit of a distance. If things are working well, it doesn't smell at all. But maybe you go on vacation, you get busy and you forget to turn it, or you do things and it starts going a little anaerobic. You maybe don't want it right next to your neighbors. So, and sometimes as you're turning it, sometimes it has a little bit of an odor, but really not much. And you want to leave room, if you can, for growth, because most people start out with one pile and pretty soon you realize that really 2 piles actually works better. And so we went from 1 to 2. Online I read there was people that went from like 1 to 8 or 10. So it gets a little bit addicting. It's kind of fun. And anyway, you do want it close to a water source because you want to use water, and it's really a drag to haul water, especially in the winter and stuff. It's bad. And you want to have space to work because you want to bring in a wheelbarrow or shovels. You want to have maybe your pitchfork to turn it, so you need a little room to work. And you can choose how you want to do it. I mean, do you want a hot compost? Do you want a cold? How do you want to do it? Do you want to just make a pile? Do you actually want a container? Do you want a bin? Do you just want a bin, or do you want one that's a rotating one? And a lot of times people really do like containers, especially in town. Containers are great. They look neater. They're a little easier to shelter from pests. They can go from absolutely simple to super fancy. You can make them homemade with pallets and lumber. We use cinder blocks. But if you go online, there are so many different bins available. It's really kind of fun to look through. With a slow method, with the absolute pure slow method, you could just go ahead and put some non-woody yard waste and some kitchen waste and just make it in a pile, walk away, and don't look at it for about a year. And you're going to have compost. You know, it'll be a little slow, but it'll work. I mean, nature decomposes stuff all the time. It just takes a long time. And you could even go ahead and add fresh waste to that. You walk away and just make a little hole and put some stuff in, cover it up with some of maybe your dry leaves or straw or whatever, and it will still work. Another way that some people do that don't want to do compost, they just take some of their garden waste and they make troughs or just dig the raw stuff in right with your garden. You don't do anything to it. And you put it underground, and the little organisms that always live in our soil just go to work. They just take a little longer, but it works. And so that has been done probably for centuries also. If you want to do more of a fast one, this is the one where you need to be like super careful with what you're doing. You will collect your material for your pile, and you probably need at least a cubic yard. This one said 5 by 3. Later on, I saw 4 by 4, but you need a reasonable size pile to do that. And usually you want about 2 to 3 parts of bulking agent, which commonly is just called brown stuff. And then you can add about 1 part of the nitrogen containing, which is easier to remember as green stuff. So we're just going to take about 2 to 3 parts of brown stuff and add it with 1 part of green stuff. So that's how we do our carbon ratio. It's actually easier than the science sounds like. And then if you want to do the fast though, you're going to make your particles small. So you're going to chop, shred, mold, whatever. And you're going to start building it sort of like a lasagna. You're probably going to put your brown and your green and your brown and your green like that. And then a lot of times once you get it, you're going to kind of mix it up with your pitchfork. You want to make sure that your food scraps are never on the top. I think that's a nice way to make sure you don't get a lot of pests and rodents and different things. And it'll really cut down the odor. So make sure your brown stuff's on the top. And then check your moisture. It should feel moist. It should feel kind of like if you had a sponge and you really squeezed it, and then you felt your sponge, it would feel moist, but it wouldn't be drippy. That's sort of how you want your compost pile. And then you can go ahead and keep adding energy material and bulking. You can kind of just keep on doing that. And then if you're doing fast composting, you probably need to turn it at least weekly. And sometimes people will even turn it 1 or 2 times a week. And water kind of when it's needed. If it's real, real rainy, you probably need to cover it because you don't want to turn it into like a big swimming pool. And it'll work really slick. I think that with managing either the hot or the cold, you want to manage sort of the decay process. So it's important to have the right amount of moisture in there. You want to make sure it has air. You want to make sure it has organic materials so it can stay working as an aerobic process. When you look at the brown stuff, or what we call the bulking agent, that contains a lot of carbon. And the nitrogen is more the green stuff. That's the kind of the most of our kitchen waste. And that has a lot of amino acids. And it also gives some moisture. And so roughly we want a carbon ratio of 30:1. But a lot of the stuff we put in has carbon that's all different. And so that's why when we say 2 or 3:1, it's kind of an estimate that should get us close to 30:1. And you can kind of watch your compost pile, because if your carbon to nitrogen is too high, so like you have so much brown stuff, not much green stuff, what'll happen is your compost will just slow down. You say, hey, it's not composting, it's just sitting there. It's telling you, hey, I want more green stuff. Or if it's too low, it'll start, if you don't have enough bulky, it'll be green, it'll be wet, and it'll start to get a little bit stinky. It'll get anaerobic. So if you go, oh, this doesn't seem so good, add a whole bunch more bulking stuff. So you you cookbook it as you go, like, you're a little dry, you're a little moist, and stuff like that. So you keep an eye on it. And most compost material that you're going to be putting in there doesn't have that 30:1 ratio. So you're just going to kind of guesstimate. And the reason for that is if you look at the different materials, if you look at sawdust, carbon, it might be 500 to 600, cardboard 350 to 550, printer paper 170. Well, it's going to be really impossible to figure out exactly 30:1. So that's why this 2 to 3:1 sort of our guess to get us as close to 30:1 as we can. And with the fast one, the regularly turned one, so you're turning at least once a week, it'll get very hot, and it'll stay hot for probably a couple of weeks to a month. And when you add it, your compost pile is going to look really big. But as a compost, it's going to shrink down. You're probably going to end up with a volume that's probably maybe a half of what you started with. And then you do want it to just kind of sit and cure for about 4 to 8 weeks before you use it. And then, and part of that, I think, is it just needs a little bit of time to cure. Anyway, and it kind of does help, as it matures, it helps that nitrogen to actually become a little more available to the microorganisms. And then the temperature, during curing, you'll notice the temperature going way down. It'll start to cool, it'll stop steaming. And then one thing that's nice, and why a lot of people go ahead and do two, is you'll have one and maybe you'll have one curing, but you'll have the next door one and you'll keep adding your stuff to it. Because during that time when you think it's pretty much done, and usually what will happen is you won't be able to really see anything that looks like a food waste. It'll start looking kind of black and crumbly, and you say, okay, you must be done. And you just let it sit there for about 4 weeks. But if you have another one, then you can go ahead and keep adding fresh waste to that, so you don't actually stop. If you only have one, one of the suggestions was that if you have one and you're curing, you might even take some of your kitchen waste and then go ahead and just freeze it, so that when this one's done, then you have this buildup you can go ahead and start, so you don't actually have to just like throw it away while you're waiting for the compost to get cleared out so you can use the bin. When you look at what are bulking agents, these carbon things, it's stuff that we have all over the place. We can use wood chips, sawdust, hay, wheat straw, corn stalks, dried leaves. A lot of times in the fall, we have lots of dried leaves, and shredded newspaper, cardboard, pine needles, wood ash. Brown stuff is all around. It's pretty easy to come across. Our energy agents are the green stuff, and we have those too. We have grass clippings, and then in one place I saw people did use some dairy. I had a lot of places said don't use dairy. We've tried to stay away from dairy. If there is manure that is from an animal that does not eat meat, so if you have a rabbit or a chicken, or you have a hamster or a gerbil or whatever you have, and they never eat meat, they're pure herbivores, you can actually use their manure in your compost pile. But if you have an animal such as a dog or a cat, There are pathogens in that the compost does not take care of. So absolutely don't use dog and cat poop in your compost. So and actually people can get sick from that, like cats have salmonella and some other things. So just avoid any animal that eats, like I guess a omnivore or a carnivore, absolutely can't use that. But some of the stuff that we can use are grass clippings, eggshells, garden trimmings, kitchen waste, coffee grounds, and paper filters are great. Uh, Paper tea bags with the tea, that's also great. So there's an awful lot of stuff that we can get out of our kitchen that we can put into our compost. Dairy products I saw in some lists, yes, some lists no. Just to be safe, we don't, because our fear was we would start to attract animals and pests, and so we just don't do that. You don't want to put in a lot of diseased plants, especially if you are doing slow compost, because it probably won't kill the disease, and then certainly you don't want to put it out into your garden the next year. You never want to use any fat, grease, lard, meat, fish, bones, any of that kind of stuff you don't want to use. Black walnut has a substance that will prevent other things from growing, so you don't want that in your compost. Cedar is bad because well, the reason it makes such great like cedar fence posts and stuff like that, it just doesn't decompose very well. So if you put it in there, it will just sit there. It just doesn't, it's just a nuisance. It's very, very, very slow. So just keep it out. Never use pet waste. No cat litter, nothing like that. Coal and charcoal, most places say keep out of there. Product stickers and stuff like that. Glossy paper sometimes has different chemicals in it that make the colors and the glossiness. Keep that out of there. Especially if you're going to use this on vegetables and stuff you're going to eat, it's just better to keep that stuff out of your garden. And compostable food service and bags. You know, I've gone places and you get like your soup or whatever, and it's this nice little cardboard thing, and it says compostable. But what that means is commercially compostable. Most home yard compost don't get hot enough to dissolve that. So even if some of those say compostable, they mean industrial. So don't put it in yours. A lot of places say don't use dryer lint either. And moisture, I guess all the places, they all need to be moist but not soaking wet. Check the moisture when you're turning. Usually in South Dakota, especially like if it's really hot, like 104, piles dry out pretty fast. You might go out and want to go ahead and just put the hose on a little bit. And hot piles decay faster than cold piles. Small piles hold less heat, so the bigger piles really stay warm better. And 2 piles are really fun. And remember, the microorganisms need oxygen, and the pile should be porous if you can, so it can draw in oxygen. And some of these bulking agents, like the straws and stuff like that, they keep it so it's not squashed down so tight, and you can get better air in there. And the pile will actually shrink as it's decomposing, so that kind of helps when we turn it over so it doesn't just smash down too much. And our little microorganisms, usually the raw material that we put in there has loads and loads and loads of microorganisms. And so a lot of times in the store, you'll see stuff that will say, you know, compost starter and soil with compost magic in it and stuff like that. And really, most of the time, the organisms are there, you know, like you build it, they will come, you know. So you're probably wasting your time buying a whole lot of these compost starters, because really, if you put a handful of soil in there, it's just loaded. Like I think I read one pea-sized one has a billion microorganisms. So really, a few handfuls of soil and you're in business. And also, if it's right on the ground, they're all going to crawl up in there anyway and say, hey, great food. So anyway, and the best source of microorganisms is finished compost. The soil, compost, put it in, and it's free. So kind of save your money. And a lot of times, even some of the nutrients that they sell you to put into your compost, most of your nutrients are right in all your raw materials, and so they're usually not necessary. On the other hand, once in a while, let's say you have just tons of leaves and you have tons of dry stuff, and you notice you're in there and you don't have much green, and you have all this bulking, and your thing has kind of come to a stop. I mean, the balance is off. Sometimes people will put some fertilizer in some water, get it kind of dilute, and spray a little bit of that on there to just add some more green. And that sort of will like cook the pot, sort of like, and that's only in the circumstance where maybe you've added way too much brown. And you can kind of save it by just maybe adding a little fertilizer. And a lot of times things like bone meal and blood meal and stuff they try to sell you, really is not magic. Most of the time you don't need any of that stuff. And when you actually use compost, you can sprinkle it on, you can mix it in, you can rake it into tree beds. And one of the things that's kind of cool is you can use it to sort of revitalize some of your houseplants. You know, some of mine sit in pots for like a long time, and they probably have really old soil, and I probably should repot some of them, but you really mix them up, add a little compost. They love it. It's very, very helpful. So it amends the soil, could be used as a mulch. It's really helpful. And so now, this is Dan and Mary's experience, and this is our experiment. So anyway, we took the Master Gardener course. Neither one of us had ever composted. We didn't know a dang thing about it. But we took the course, and I said, wow. We both said, this is pretty cool. We want to start. So how are we going to do it? Well, I did go to the store, and I found a little bucket, and it's not very big, and I have it right next to my sink. So whenever I'm cooking in the kitchen and doing stuff, I can just toss it right into the sink. So it's really like, just open up the lid, and as I'm peeling or whatever, I'm just flipping the stuff in there. And then I can close it, and so it's not unsightly, it doesn't smell, it's not real huge. And since our compost pile actually is a little ways from the house, not super far, but it's just way the other side of the end of our driveway, we decided to put a bucket in the garage. So when our little bucket in the kitchen is full, we just go to the door that goes from the kitchen to the garage and dump it into that little bucket. And what we found was that we had an amazing amount of kitchen waste. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I'm sure we've been putting this stuff in the garbage can forever. And I was like, man, this little bucket fills up really fast. So it was really surprising. So, and as you can tell, we are slow composters. These are not all ground, but it's coffee grounds and carrot ends. And if I forgot a zucchini and it gets soft or whatever, we just throw it in. And so we also, actually my husband, built out by our Morton building, our own little, he used just some cinder blocks and put it out by the Morton building. And we used just the black tarp to cover it up so it didn't, if it rained, so it wouldn't get too wet. And so it just lived out there for a while. And we found pretty soon that we went to a bigger bucket because our little bucket, I said, man, we have a lot of waste, you know. And so we had to go to a bigger bucket. We had to go buy a new bucket. And then my husband takes it down to, and again, we are slow composters. That we just put everything in there, like banana peels. You can probably see all kinds of stuff in there. And anyway, we had to build another one. So just like that, we started with one, now we have two. And we fancied up the top. We don't use our little tarp anymore because we live on a hilltop and it is always windy. And our little tarp blew away all the time. So my husband now has two little metal parts that used to, I think, be siding or something. And we have a big brick that sits on top of them so that it doesn't blow away all the time. And if it rains, like this year, we had a ton of rain. So that actually helped it. And this isn't watertight, so that things kind of drain out pretty well too. And so what we do is we keep a fresh one and an old one. And so if you look on the left side, that's actually our one that's pretty close to mature. And the one on the right is the one we're working on right now. It has a bunch of green stuff, and then we just covered it with a bunch of brown. So if you look at it, That's the one that we're just working on. So we kind of layered. We have some brown and some green. That's the top that's brown. And so it just, obviously doesn't look very much like soil. But then if you look at the other side, it's starting to look a whole bunch like soil. And this is actually how we're set up, what we did it. This is our house is up here, our driveway. This is our Morton building. We put them there. Our water source, we have a water source like right here. So we have this, and then we have our raised beds right there. So it's pretty nice to, it's a little bit away from the house, but it's real handy to our raised beds. And it's really close to the water source, which is super nice. And the other thing that Dan said about the cinder blocks is when we are out there turning, and sometimes especially when we're harvesting to put it into a wheelbarrow, we can actually pull some of the cinder blocks away. So we have free access to the whole thing there, which made it pretty nice for us to work with. And the amazing, amazing thing is we probably did everything wrong. And you know what? It was like magic. Honest to goodness, it is like magic. I just couldn't believe it. And I guess so the kind of my final words are, don't be overwhelmed. Compost is nature's way of recycling. When the leaves just fall down at the bottom of the tree, nobody waters them and turns them and cares about the carbon ratio. But you know what? They compost. That's exactly what happens. It's been happening for as long as the Earth's here. And backyard composting actually is very forgiving. So even when you make mistakes, you end up with pretty darn good compost, actually. And so avoid analysis paralysis. I would say get started, learn as you go, and it's fun. So, thank you. And I want to pass this around. Open it up, take a good whiff.
How long do you figure your